Hello and a warm welcome to this video. Today I am delighted to be joined by, in my opinion, one of the greatest thought leaders in the art and science of how and why customers buy. So warm welcome to Marcus Cauchi. Marcus, I follow you a lot on social media. We've known each other for many years. And recently I've seen a lot of frustration in some of your posts. So I want to dive straight in and ask you, what are you seeing out there right now that's really winding you up?
The abject stupidity and willful ignorance of leadership, investors, and management really pisses me off to a degree that's probably going to cause my fat old body to have a heart attack at some point. I've reached the point in my career where I'm now in the fortunate position where I don't really care. And I look at the way bad money poisons perfectly fine companies by making the customer a forgotten afterthought at the end of a long chain of abuse. That then permeates throughout the entire organization. So leadership is then tainted by their greed for rapid growth and their valuation. Let me just be absolutely clear. Getting funding is not a win in most cases. Getting funding is pretty much your suicide note because what most businesses will do is they will start to abuse their people who will then abuse the customer. The customer has become this forgotten, inconvenient afterthought at the end of a long chain of abuse that starts with the emphasis on efficiency rather than effectiveness in marketing. It then permeates into who and how you recruit. So you recruit salespeople who are money motivated with a will to win. And as a result, the customer is just forgotten. So buyer safety is something that just is a non thing. Seller safety is a forgotten thing. And if your salespeople don't feel safe and they're always looking over their shoulder, they will do anything and everything to keep their job and hit their quota. Partner safety is something that virtually every organization forgets entirely. And as a result, what you've got is all these people at the top poisoning a perfectly fine business into doing stupid and dangerous things. So they fixate on top of the funnel new business instead of focusing on customer retention and delivering value to the customer for life. When you prospect, you should be prospecting for a customer who'll be a customer in 5 and 10 years' time, not hitting your quota. But everyone's obsessed with top of the funnel.
Now, I've got a theory of why that is, and I think it's a form of cognitive bias. And I'm going to make it up, and Daniel Kahneman will probably have a go at me, but I'm going to call it the novelty bias. Because even I'm susceptible to that a little bit. You know, that a new lead comes in, there's an excitement that rises. They go, oh, cool, a new customer, new lead, a new opportunity. There's something new about the new and the shiny. It's a combination probably with that. And I guess from the investor's perspective, the short-term thinking, i.e., let's boost sales for this quarter, let's focus on spreadsheets. And nowhere in that conversation is, here are the people that actually give us money.
You may well be right, and I suspect this is part of a bigger issue. All of this is a part of a wicked problem. And my pal, Alexander Knapp, who's just been trying to sort out the fallout as a result of Biden withdrawing from Afghanistan. So you can imagine the shitstorm that comes with that. He describes wicked problems as having 4 key qualities. The first one is that whatever you try first will fail. So you've got to capture the data, learn the lessons, apply them, rinse and repeat. And every startup and scale-up organization is essentially a series of hopefully non-fatal experiments. But you have to run those experiments in parallel, because if you try and solve a complex, interdependent, interrelated problem with point solutions, all you do is move the symptom. The second is that the rules change as you go. The third is stakeholders differ. And the fourth is there are no perfect solutions, only imperfect outcomes. Now, when you look at sales and marketing and running a business as a wicked problem, all of these things are interdependent. And the problem here is that people in leadership positions tend to be incredibly short-sighted, and investors in particular are fixated on three things, which is new logos, new revenue, and pipeline. And what they really mean is the forecast. Forecasting is a total waste of time. If you manage the pipeline well, the forecast falls out naturally at the bottom, and you've got a clear idea of what is coming and what's not, and what will land and what won't. But what we know is that on average, in a cold sales cycle, 1 in 20 will convert into a piece of business, on average. 1 in 6 warm cycles, i.e. they've been referred to you, are likely to convert. And this is based on 240,000 instances that Ivan Meisner's organization ran a few years back. Now, what's interesting about a warm cycle is that on average, a warm prospect will spend 2.5 times more than a cold on their initial order. They will buy 3 times as frequently, and they will refer 4 times as often. So you multiply that out, and it's now 128 times more valuable than a cold. Now, when you sell hot, i.e. you sell to existing customers, or if you're smart, what you do is you identify strategic alliance partners who are already intimate and close to their customers, and you build hot relationships with them. On average, if Marcus introduced me to somebody, I guarantee there is 100% chance that I would take that call. And if it was timely and relevant and I could afford it, there is at least a 70 to 90% probability that I would buy, which means that it's 14 to 18 times more likely that that piece of business would convert. So where on God's earth does it make any sense for us to beat our head against the wall and then blame the brick for our headache by going in cold? That is stupid. And the problem is there is serial stupidity at every level throughout organizations because of the toxic nature of the way the money behind you permeates your organization. And you're looking at the mental health problems within sales. They are massive. The young talent is not being nurtured. They hire 10 in the hope that 3 survive a year and 1 might make it to the end of the second year. This is obscene. These are human beings we're talking about, and this is apparently okay. And then, to speak to our original point, a 15% churn rate, which is quite acceptable in the SaaS space, means that you have to replace 49% of your customers every 3 years. I mean, seriously, the economics of that defies any belief. But anyone who says that we are there to represent and safeguard shareholder value and does that is absolutely negligent and should be fired or broken on the wheel.
And I think if we get upstream, there's some serious fundamental problems here. And I'm going to go back to short-termism again, and also just a normalization of practices that has become common. It's a cultural thing of this is what we do as investors or whatever. I mean, one of the books I was reading before we jumped on, which of Range.
Fabulous,
fabulous book, and it says actually, but if you are just a specialist in investing or a specialist CFO or a specialist in marketing or sales, you're looking around and you're just looking within your little bubble. You're looking at this is how everyone else is doing it, therefore I'm going to copy it. But it is very much the blind leading the blind, because we look at the situation we're in, like you say, with the burnout, with the mental health piece, it's not working. And it's the analogy that springs to mind is that of content. So most content is what I would term dead on arrival. Yeah. You put content out, no one looks at it, no one cares, because it's just people saying what they want to say rather than understanding the target audience and really trying to add value. And you actually, I study success. I look at which bits of content have gone viral, and you look at the amount of work and research that have gone into it. The trick is that you act like an author that writes a book. If you want to put out a white paper, you get teams of researchers. You look at what's already out there. You bring in some thought leaders. You invest time and do it properly. It's a long-term piece, because the question is your content shareable, yes or no? And if it is shareable by your target audience, it's added value. And we've all had that experience of a bit of content that we love and we forward onto our friends and colleagues and so on. And I guess it's it's the same in all these business practices. If we just focus on the short term, rather than actually taking our time and doing it properly, taking our time to build those client relationships, not pulling sales cycles forward, and actually pull right back and go, listen, like rather than volume, let's look at Pareto's law and say, who are the best customers based on lifetime value? How can we get our current customer crop to actually grow and be at that level? And then also, how can we increase sales conversion rate without pulling things forward? And I guess those are the couple of things I really want to touch on with this conversation with you, Marcus, because we at Fountain, obviously, we optimize each stage of the funnel. But obviously, there's a lot more to be done in terms of generating the quality and quantity of leads. And we can make sure they're high quality based on data on lifetime value and profit. But then when we get the leads to the sales team, there's only so much we can do. There's remarketing and retargeting. There's email nurturing. But I really want to just touch on the sales stuff, because obviously you've worked with salespeople for, gosh, how long now, Marcus? 30 years?
Well, I've been in sales 35 years, at least the last 18 in hundreds, thousands of companies. I've probably helped my clients add 6.5 billion to their top line. And what I've found is that unless you start with the customer and everything evolves from there with them at the heart, then you're probably going to end up. This is a really depressing statistic. Did you know that 40% of tickets raised on help desks are caused because engineers built the product? Because what happens is when a tech company starts, what typically happens is they start really as the customer, and they think, there's a better way. So they build this product to try and solve a problem that they have. And as they grow, they become more and more divorced from the customer. And then they start coming up with great ideas, and they don't talk to the customer. And so my whole philosophy is you start with the customer and you start with the problem that the customer has, and you focus 95% of your effort and energy and resource on the problem. And the solution pops out at the end quite naturally. And that's where your 5% of effort goes. But everyone is doing it the other way around. They're coming up with solution. And they're not really thinking about the problem.
And that's purely, I'm assuming, because they're not engaging and thinking from the customer's perspective.
Yeah. Like I said, the customers are forgotten afterthought. They're inconvenient. Oh, bloody customers, idiot customer. I mean, how often have you heard salespeople blame the customer for the fact that, one of my favorite lessons I learned when I was back in Sandler was that you can never blame the prospect. It's always you. A prospect objects because you took them there. If they're complaining about your price, it's because you haven't demonstrated any real value to them. Contextually, it has to be valuable to them. Timely, relevant, and valuable. If any of your content is not timely, it's not relevant, or it's not valuable, it's not going to get shared. And people are just going to drop it. And just look at your own inbox. How much of that is filled with drivel that you spend most of your day just deleting? I get 500 emails a day. Yeah. And I would say maybe 12 of them I'm interested in. I don't know what percentage that is, but it's pretty small.
It's absolutely tiny.
It's about a 0.2%.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So I'm imagining right now, let's use this, let's walk the walk a little bit. We'll have people, like clients of ours will be listening, and they'll probably pass it on to their sales team, and they'll definitely introduce them to your amazing Inquisitor podcast that I want to give a shout out to.
Thank you.
One of the best sales podcasts around. But what would you suggest? What are the sort of the core fundamentals? Like, what do we mean by putting the customer first and obsessing about the customer? Give me some examples that you would do if you were speaking to a salesperson now who's been doing it a certain way and are curious about improving.
I'm going to share my screen with you because I think it's important that, where are we? Share screen. Share screen. Okay. So share window. That one. There we go. Right. Okay. So at the heart of everything that I do, and I've established a global community for anyone who really is passionate about this stuff and is serious about it. We're on a mission to make sales a force for good, because I genuinely believe we are a noble profession. And at the heart of it must be buyer safety. And in order for customers and buyers to feel safe, you have to be reliable, you have to be responsive, and you have to be relevant to them. And that it starts with rigorous authenticity. You must never lie, exaggerate, understate, or be economical with the truth. Because buyers have, with good reason, little or no trust in salespeople. And this means you need to be vulnerable enough to admit when you messed up, when you don't know, or when a competitor would be a better solution for them. It's your duty, your responsibility to be ready to say, you should go and speak to those guys. They're my closest competitor. They have a solution that would be better for you. Now, if you had a full pipeline, then you wouldn't have the problem that you're scrabbling around to try and make your number. And that problem started weeks or months ago because you didn't do your prospecting correctly.
Yes.
The next thing is you need to be ready to dive into some really good constructive conflict, which means that you need to be ready to challenge them. You need to be ready to fight. And in fact, it's the grit in the oyster makes the pearl. And that book's range is all about having diverse teams with different opinions come together to tackle the problem. And one of my favorite people on the planet, a guy called Tom Schodorf, took his company, Splunk, from 42 million to 1.3 billion in 5 years. And they used to have stand-up fights all the time internally. And it's brilliant. And that means you have to recruit people who are different to you, who are going to challenge your thinking. And that doesn't mean it's not just about skin color or ethnicity or whatever. It's about people from different economic backgrounds, different ages, different socio-economic and religious backgrounds, different politics, all that kind of stuff, so that you can churn through the problem and look at it through a different lens and come up with a much better solution. And then ambiguity is the mother of all foobarrs. You've got to communicate with absolute clarity, and that means you have to slow down. You have to sometimes take it on the chin and say, I don't know. Let me think this through, and then come back with clear, unambiguous direction, clear, unambiguous messaging. But again, how often do we see this drivel coming out and it's just features and functionality? And I'm trying to think, well, how is this relevant? I need to know that contextually, this is about me in my moment. Because people do not buy your product or your service outright, ever. And no one ever has, and no one ever will. They rent it for as long as the outcome is relevant to them. So if I'm driving around in a DB9, and I love it, and when I press the ignition button, it goes, and I love the sound. And if I'm going to buy a loaf of bread, I'll jump in the car because I love it that much. All of a sudden, my parents get ill. A DB9 is really not convenient for having people in wheelchairs. So now I have to buy myself, a Fiat ugly car with a sliding door and a wheelchair ramp. And whilst my adoption and consumption of the DB9 is through the roof, it's no longer relevant for my circumstance. Then customer centricity. This is all about having the customer at the heart of everything that you do. You cannot be selfish in sales or marketing. It must always be about the customer. And so this is about you forming a long-term partnership with your customer. And partners help each other get better. They fight, they argue, they disagree, but ultimately it's all about the customer's success. You've got to be able to create strong and sustainable agreements that weather the tests of time, that weather change, and weather adversity. So you're deeply collaborative with your customer. Your customers should, you should be listening to and speaking to your customers. How many senior executives in your organization are speaking to customers every day, every week, are listening? One of my favorite companies is a company called Authentic, set up by a lady called Amy Brown. And they listen to 10 billion conversations with customers, unfiltered, every year. They use AI to suck this information in, and then they play these audio montages to the boards of these US health companies. And their jaws drop when they hear both the positive effect, but also the negative effect of how they're treating those customers. And then the customer's success is more important than your success. If you help them become successful, you'll become successful too. It's Emerson's law of compensation. You have to get more, you have to give more. And so you work with them and move away from being transactional and short-term to focusing on their sustained success over time. So you're co-developing solutions, you're creating value, and you're delivering the outcomes that they need at that moment, and you're planning ahead. You can't do that if you're not listening. And this is the problem, because buyer safety has been forgotten in and been replaced by selfish short-term greed, where we're focused on growth instead of scale. We're focused on short-term results. I mean, as a private company, why on earth do you need to work on quarterly reporting cycles, other than so you can fiddle the valuation? So notionally, your business is worth millions or billions when it isn't. I know companies that they're making a loss and turning over hundreds of thousands that have valuations in the tens of millions. It's a myth. Absolute horse shit. Just terrible.
I think the other side of greed as well is fascinating, Marcus, is fear. It ties into sort of just like fear of losing what you've got, fear of shrinking, fear of losing to competition. And that actually, it does lead to unethical behavior. That double coin of fear and greed, it's the ego there. And it means people are their lesser selves. Aristotle said that, didn't he? Is that, it's very easy for a rich man who's happy and content to be ethical. But, you take away his money, you chuck him on the streets and see how moral he is then.
And absolutely. But again, you've got 6 big competitors: fear, apathy, ignorance, denial, ego, and the status quo. And the problem, there was a meta study that I read about, it must have been 15, 16 years ago. And it was 330 studies on mankind's greatest fear. And what fell out the other end was the future, because with it comes uncertainty. And this is where partnering with your customers really makes a difference. Listening to your customers really makes a difference, because what they fear is the uncertainty. Give them certainty and people don't fear change. But it's the uncertainty that they fear. And the problem is that if you're fixated on features and functionality, hitting your quota, you're not giving them that peace of mind. You're not giving them that certainty. And by certainty.
Sorry, go on.
Go, no, I'm done.
I think that's where your final point really resonated with me about the status quo. Well, that's just how we do it. That's how everyone else seems to do it. There's also safety in that, of just looking around and seeing what everyone else is doing and doing that, rather than actually starting to challenge it and getting people from the outside to come and challenge the status quo.
There's some amazingly interesting research by Corporate Visions and Stanford University, and they ran the data from 300 complete CRM systems. And their findings were 60% of buying cycles ended up in the status quo. 10.4% ended up in an RFP, where the win rate was 1 in 4. So if you're running an RFP business, on average, you're probably going to win 2.6% of the business sales cycles you start. And then 29.6% end up with the organization that early in the sales cycle destabilizes their current preferences. That means they come in and they challenge them. Now, there are 2 types of challenger. There's the arsehole challenger who turns up as a know-all, and then there's the challenger who has the customer's best interests at heart. And it's the second one. Challenger, the sales methodology, did the first study they did. They didn't test the bottom performers. They tested the middle and top performers. Yes. And their conclusion was 50% of top performers have a challenger approach to their selling. There was a later study that covered the bottom, middle, and top performers. And what they also found was that 50% of the bottom performers had a challenger approach. So you need to be respectful and you need to be nurturing. So they turn up, they destabilize the current preferences, so they challenge. They create a good business case. So in addition to the emotional, they also give the rational business case to support their argument. They create enough distance and white space between what they are offering, the status quo, and the competition. And this is critical, they inoculate them against anticipated buyer's remorse, regret, and blame. And if you haven't done that, then you just fall into the status quo category. All 4 of those are critical. So check them out. Corporate Visions have some fantastic videos and freebies on the type of story that you should tell. So one of the things that they say, which is really interesting, is that in the period before renewal, talk about all sorts of new ideas. When you're in the renewal period, consolidate on why the decision they made was great. Otherwise, you increase the probability of moving it to an RFP by at least 10%. So again, do your research, think around the problems, and recognize that what you are doing probably stinks. Even if you're growing, the chances are there are lots and lots of ways that you can improve by paying attention to what your customers are telling you, and listening to your customer is the starting point. The other thing that we have to do is get salespeople off the technique and the automation shtick that so many are on, and really teach them about business. A book that every salesperson should read is the 10-Day MBA, just so you understand what the hell these people are talking about every day internally, so that you know about how they're dealing with international trade and how they're having to manage their finances, and to understand what's going on in the background. Because if you don't understand the implications of a purchase, then is it any wonder that they resist and you end up in a stall?
No, I think that's fascinating. The sort of trying to get back to just the first principles here. I mean, to make it really simple, is like what we're talking about is salespeople acting on a series of assumptions.
Yeah.
So they feel they know their target audience and their customer and their prospect, and actually the game of business is won or lost based on how few blind spots you have. Everything you've just spoken about is about just eliminating blind spots and false assumptions, because they're living in an absolute bizarre reality where they don't understand the implications for the prospect of buying this, because they haven't read the 10-Day MBA. They're not commercially aware, which is a big problem, I think, among salespeople. And they're not living in that person's shoes. If they could actually live in their head just for half an hour and hear the conversations they're having about this purchase, about this RFP, they would actually probably realize there's a lot of false assumptions. And I see this with my own guys a little bit, that when we're dealing with a pitch on RFP, one of the things we try and get the prospects to do is just come in as are workshopping our presentation and put together our strategy, see what we're doing, so you can see how we work, you can meet the team. But most importantly, you can say, actually, no, you're going down this direction, but that's not really what we're prioritizing, it's this, and so on, because so much data is lost between the initial call with the head of client services, with Rachel, and then the actual team itself. And it happens with everybody. But for me, it's just eliminating blind spots and maximizing understanding of exactly what the customer's going. Because if you lived in their body, you'd know exactly what they want. So let's try and do that. But instead, I think most salespeople and marketing teams, especially, marketing teams are the worst. They never speak to the target market. They talk amongst themselves. And it just blows my mind. I interviewed Grant Leibooth. I don't know if you know Grant, Sticky Marketing. He's written 8 or 9 books. Brilliant. When he comes and consults with some of the biggest companies in the world, and meets the CMO, meets the whole marketing team, he asks them one question, and that question will determine whether they are going to have a lot of work.
When was the last time you spoke to a customer?
Absolutely right.
And the answer is never.
There's occasionally it's good people like, yesterday, this morning, I'm always speaking, always trying to understand. But that's maybe the top of the Pareto curve.
You're the 1%. The 1%.
How do I speak to a customer? Or you're writing content for them. I don't get access to customers.
It's an act of idiocy and self-sabotage, not speaking to your customer. Your customer will tell you that the whole idea of clientology that I'm running now is that your customer will tell you how to sell to them if only you bother to talk to them and you listen to what's really going on and what they're trying to achieve. But next to nobody does that. And I hope by now that you know that I'm not really a tree hugger by any stretch of the imagination. But you have to love your customer. You have to love your salespeople. And that is absent. And that's forgotten. And I don't think it's ever really been there in the last 30, 40 years, since Satan's own lieutenant, Milton Friedman, came along and came up with the idea that we all have to serve shareholder value. Let me be clear about something. Investors are the last in the food chain, as far as I'm concerned. Investors are risk-taking speculators who have thrown some money at a business in the hope that they will get a return later. First and foremost, you have to love your people, look after your people, and really take care of them. Recruit them well, and then onboard them brilliantly, and then develop them and make sure that you really look after your people. Because if you look after your people, whether they're sales, marketing, operations, customer success, they will look after your customers, and then customers come next. Your partners are absolutely key. They are not a get out of sales free card, which is what most organizations treat their partners as. Your partners are in business for their reasons, not your reasons. And if you don't understand that and understand what they're trying to achieve, then why the hell would they bother to take you in? You're just another product in their portfolio. You're a SKU, nothing more. And you have no right to demand anything of them unless you treat them with that respect. And then investors way down the food chain, and somewhere along the line, you come probably after that as the owner. But nowadays, it's all completely skew with, and that whole thing's been flipped. Although partners are normally at the bottom of that pile, which is a mistake.
I mean, it sounds also you're speaking from seeing some nasty real, you don't name names, but you must have seen some quite nasty examples of investors coming in and destroying the customer relationship and shaking things up to focus on short-termism, then the thing falls apart. But they don't care because you're one of many in a portfolio of speculation. So it's burn and churn.
Exactly. Well, I remember speaking to a private equity firm not long ago, and they had 42 companies. It wasn't a big PE, but they had 42 companies. And they said, well, if 3 of them make it, then we've made our money back and our investors get their money back with a return. And that's terrible. I mean, how dare they? Because all these people, excuse me, all these people have put their lives on the line. They've probably taken a lien on their house to get this business up and running. And they're perfectly happy to let 39 of them die on the vine because they make out like a bandit. Who cares about who suffers? That's immoral. That's irresponsible. That's bad business.
No, it's terrible. And I think this is where we've got to. But that, like you say, where it starts with Milton Friedman, it permeates our thinking. A lot of us, and even some stuff I've taken from today personally. We report quarterly. Well, why? We don't have. The 4 founders are the shareholders. We don't have any external investors. So why do we need to do that? There's things that you model because that's just the norm, the status quo. But again, I love going back to first principles and going, well, what's this actually serving? Why are we doing this? And actually, what does success look like? Well, it's actually building a community of clients who are helping achieve their goals, get the best return on investment. But it's a thriving community where they grow, not just financially, but professionally with us as well and our teams. There's something beautiful there. There's that human connection, which you were alluding to earlier on.
By all means, begin with the end in mind. What is the business we intend to become? And work towards that. What's the environment we want to create? For me, I want to create an environment where we grow profitably, where we become a destination employer, where people will queue and give their right arm to become part of our team, where our team recommends to people they care about that they join us. That's how we recruit the best talent on the planet. And people will come and work with those. You only have to look at the statistic at the moment. Gartner released a report that 42%, it's the Great Resignation, 42% of people in the US or in the Western world are looking to change jobs this year. That's happening. In the US, 4 million a month are changing jobs voluntarily because they're just sick of working with the companies that they're working with at the moment. They've had enough and they want something more from life. And if you create that kind of destination employer brand, then you never have a problem recruiting. If you invest in your people, instead of seeing them as a commodity that you can churn and burn, but you see it as your responsibility as the manager. You hired them. You're responsible for getting the best out of them and helping them become wildly successful. So I did a post last week or the week before where it was a dialogue between a new VP and the manager saying, oh, we've got to get rid of these clowns on my sales team. But actually, that manager has been badly let down because the typical pathway to management is a tap on the shoulder where you get tapped on the shoulder and say, Marcus, we've just fired your idiot manager. You're now the idiot manager. Congratulations. And they have no runway. I believe that anyone in the recruitment process, part of that should be, okay, so you're succeeding in this role and it's 2 years from now. What's your next job? what do we need to, what's the roadmap, the pathway we have to help you develop along in order that you are prepared for that next role? So do you want to move into management? Do you want to move into channel? Do you want to move into senior sales and work on larger enterprise accounts? Do you want to move into operations? Do you want to move into customer success? Great. Okay. So this is the pathway that we're going to help you develop along. And one of the things I love to do with my new hires is the last hire is responsible for mentoring the next one in, because what that means is they're giving the warts and all. They know how bad or good the onboarding process is, and they can give feedback, and they're teaching. Because one of the lessons that I learned 20 years ago was the quickest way to learn is to teach, because you have to understand it from every angle. Now, that's a fantastic way of filtering for that talent in management. And so they've got 18 to 24 months learning the ropes, understanding how to be a great manager. So instead of doing what was done to you, which is largely abuse and bullying and beating the table and pounding your chest and saying, you've got to do more leads, make more calls.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my tablets. What if instead you bothered to help them to make that journey and be prepared for that role? So when they move into it, they are phenomenally well prepared. They don't have to be nervous. They don't have to do what was done to them.
That's brilliant. And I think at Fountain, we're so big on culture, that's second nature to us, partly because actually 3 of the 4 founders met in a very toxic culture where people will be running off and crying in the bathrooms and all that sort of stuff. And I remember I was saying, like, what if we build a place where people can flourish? We build a place where no one ever goes home crying. What if we, and it came from that. But I love what you're saying, because it just resonates so much with us, because it goes back to the thing of we're all just humans, right? We all need meaning and connection. And I think that's where, again, you look at it from an investor perspective, you're just a number on a spreadsheet. You're a cost, you're a fixed cost. And we need to move away from this sort of 80s Gordon Gekko mindset, really, that still is around.
Poison. Absolute poison. You saw, look at what happened in the financial crisis. That greed was created by 50 people. Yes. You know, there's 49 men and 1 woman created that financial crisis. And that is obscene that they were able to do that. And there is no justification for it. It's absolute travesty.
I mean, you think of, and they all got very rich from it. So you think of the trade-off for those 50 versus the absolute misery among millions, if not billions, of human beings off the back of it. And a lot of it is about just maturing as people, developing as leaders. I think, again, I'll introduce you to Dr. Alan Watkins, because that's his mission, to work with the leaders, the C-suites of the biggest companies in the world, and help them develop vertically. I think a lot of people add more skills, but if they don't have if they don't have a mature mindset, if they are still ego-driven, impulsive, all the rest of it, if they don't work that out, because the way Alan will talk about it, it's a case of maturity. That, for example, my 7-year-old son, if I showed him some algebra, and said, right, 4x equals 16, what is x? He'll never be able to get that. He doesn't have that level of sophistication, maturity. I show that to a 12-year-old and they'll go, yeah, well, it's 4. They'll know it instantly. And the point being, you've got all these people walking around, even though they might be men who are in their 50s in suits and all the rest of it, they may have the emotional maturity probably of my 7-year-old son. And they'll be Not even, right? No. But they need to be on that. So it's challenging people to not just look at, the thing Alan talks about is it's 4 dimensions of leadership. That you have your own dimension, your reality. You have, which is I, you have we, which is another dimension of how different people are interacting. So lots of other people's realities as a group. Then you have short-term and long-term thinking. And until you take a wicked problem and start looking at it in every different dimension as a leader, then you can start seeing, because you can go, well, this benefits me. But actually, what does this mean to the we? What does it mean to everyone else? What does this mean long-term for the business? What does it mean long-term for me? And you start looking at different dimensions. You're like, actually, this is a pretty stupid way to be. I'm actually just worked up and I'm being impulsive and emotional. Quite frankly, there's no room for emotion in business in that sort of ego-driven anger sort of way. But a lot of people aren't working on being a more patient person, not being angry at staff, not thumping their fist on the table, none of that. There isn't that conversation. It's how can I get more skills to acquire more cash and be more,
Well, this then comes to an entire philosophy that you work for your people. They don't work for you. As a manager or as a leader, you work for them and they work for your customers. And it's your job to serve them. Service is not servitude. And this is where I think we've forgotten. And it's heartbreaking to see where so much talent is being burnt out, misspent, misdirected, and it has this hangover effect. Now, what's really interesting is if you get this right early on, then there's a flywheel effect because it's part of the culture. And when someone comes in from outside and they start bringing this toxic, poisonous thinking in, it's stopped immediately. But it should not be tolerated. And this is where leaders and managers really need to grow a spine. You just got to stop that stuff early. You got to confront it and say, that is not how we do things around here. Where people say, oh, we've always done it this way. So what? You've got to question it. You've got to challenge things. Being more humane, being more compassionate, loving your people, loving your customers is absolutely at the heart of creating that buyer and seller and safety. And it's so amiss. There are very few organizations that even come close. And so that explains why a lot of people don't want to go to work. They go to work to collect the paycheck, and not because they love it and can't wait to be there.
I think what's great about this conversation is I kind of feel culture started becoming a thing in the last decade, right? In the 20 teens, businesses started jumping on culture and flat structure and just actually putting that first. I almost feel in the 2020s, post-COVID, almost feel it's becoming much more of a purpose-driven thing, people putting purpose up there with profit. And the sort of stuff you're talking about, Marcus, I feel really resonates with people because actually with a lot of people dropping out of the employment market, both in North America and here, it is a candidate's market. They can pick and choose.
There's a generational problem. I've kind of written off for large enterprises because people of my generation, frankly, that we're fat, dumb, and happy, and we've got little or no vested interest in fixing this. Where I'm excited is your generation and the next generation down, because there is much more around purpose and realizing that work is something that should give you satisfaction. You shouldn't be turning up just for a paycheck. The paycheck is a byproduct. There's a whole question around compensation, around competition, which we can talk about on another session. But read a book called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn, Kohn, where there is a really strong argument that the minute you start introducing performance-based compensation, you start to poison the well. And people will then, especially if they don't have a strong moral compass coming in, will then abuse that. If you don't love your customer, if you don't believe in the concept of buyer safety, then you'll be shouting at the screen at the moment saying, what the hell is he talking about? He's an idiot. And you're welcome to that belief. But I know that from my experience, when I help my customers and my salespeople be immensely successful, I get the reward at the end. It's a byproduct. It's not the end in itself. It's just a byproduct. The real focus has to be on making them succeed. And that's something that has been sadly lost.
Well, I think I mentioned, I told you about Liz Wiseman, I think, when we first spoke.
Fabulous work. Multipliers.
Yeah, Multipliers by Liz Wiseman. One of the quotes I love about that is leadership is about putting others on stage. I'll send you a link. She's just done an interview with Brené Brown, which is fantastic as well. So, but I love that quote, that leadership is about putting other people on stage. And I think that's so true.
And the one I love from there is you have to give them the pen. The intervention happens when they cannot move further forward without your help. And the moment they get an inkling that they can work it out for themselves, give them back the pen and let them take over. That's empowering. And it's incredible what happens when you do that.
There's a beautiful quote by, I think it's Naomi Klein. It's about coaching. And the question she always asks is, how much further in their thinking can they go before they need some of mine?
Wonderful question.
And that's it. I mean, I suffer. There's a book, I need to go back to it again, The Advice Monster. It's the second in the series from the Coaching Handbook. And it just, he just breaks you. Like, your advice isn't that good, and you don't. And it goes back actually to the point I was making before about blind spots and context. If it's their problem, they're living in it, they probably have more access to more data of what's going on, the 360 view of the problem, than you. So you're coming in and just spouting out the first crap that comes to your head and trying to help them. And instead, you're giving them another problem, which is, talking at them and offering them solutions that might not be correct based on a series of assumptions. So that's a big piece when it comes to coaching. It's something that I need to work on a lot, actually, because I tend to open my mouth quite quickly, Marcus, as you're probably aware.
It's hard not to, because you don't want to see them fail. But there is a really fundamental rule. And that rule is you have to let them fail, but not the business. And the challenge here is that in our cultures, in the West, failure is deemed some form of personality defect. Asking for help is a sign of weakness. It's anything but. It's an act of courage. When people volunteer themselves for help, it tells me that this is someone who has real inner strength. And that vulnerability, Brené Brown talks about it, vulnerability is a strength. That's been absolutely pivotal for me, recognizing that. And for 30 years of my working life, I struggled to reach out for help. Now I'm asking for help from everybody and anybody who has something to add. The podcast has been a monstrously powerful tool for that, because I've had I think it's 350 episodes plus now, and we've got maybe 4,500 years of collective wisdom on the podcast. I could never have paid for that advice. I'm not doing badly, but there's no way I could have distilled all of that. And it's there for free. It's fantastic. And if you ask people for help, more often than not, they'll give it. And if they don't, move on. I understand. Not everyone's going to be able to help, but maybe they don't want to. I've had one person refuse to help because he didn't want to help his competition when I was writing my book. That was the only instance in, 5 years. 5 years, because when we were doing the research for the original book on channel sales, we interviewed 60, 70 people, and only one person said no because he didn't want to give his secret sauce to the competitors. Everyone else was perfectly willing to. If you're a young seller or a young manager, find people whose history is your future, and then say to them, look, I'm looking for help. I believe your history is my future. My commitment to you is I will never waste your time. So I'll always come with one question to which I've tried at least 3 things and I couldn't find the answer. And then I will go away and I will implement what you tell me, and I'll come back with my lessons, even if I fail. And if I fail to do that, then you can fire me. Would you be okay giving me 15 to 20 minutes a month? And everyone I've taught this to who's done it, they've had people say yes, and their careers are skyrocketing as a result. I love that. That's a beautiful thing, I think, to end on. Because truthfully, I think getting mentorship is one of the biggest things you can do to propel yourself forward. Yeah. But that approach, I love it. Your past is my future, or your history is my future. And I love that thing of actually, I won't waste your time, 15, 20 minutes, because people can spare that. And if it's to answer one question rather than just talk and hope that something comes out of it, that's really powerful, Marcus. That's brilliant. I've got half a dozen mentors who have agreed to do that for me now. And it's brilliant. Any problem, Charlie Green, who wrote the Trust Equation, he's now my mentor. Fabulous. Trust-based selling, his best book. Absolutely fantastic. Since you've recommended this, I must have bought this for about 20 people or so, and everyone is just saying it's revolutionary for them. Yeah. Because it goes back to the fundamentals of actually being a good human being. You're not trying to sell, you're trying to serve. Yeah. And you're building trust by serving and helping. It's lovely. Which is good. Marcus, I am mindful of time. I've kept you longer than I had anticipated, or at least told you I would. So we'll call it there. I think there's some great stuff we can cut up that people will find really valuable. And of course, we'll put the whole thing on, because I'm sure there's a few people I know that would enjoy watching the two Marcuses rant for a good hour. So I'll end the broadcast. Actually, just quickly before we wrap up, Inquisitor Podcast, definitely worth listening to. How else can people get in touch with you? LinkedIn's probably the best way, because I'm on there a lot. I produce an outrageous amount of content on there, and it's becoming particularly vociferous at the moment because I'm seeing so much abuse going on, and I'm championing that. the Sales of Force for Good community. Get involved in that.
Yeah.
And I'm just in the throes of writing a couple of books on strategic alliances and the sales management apprenticeship. So if anyone wants to participate in my research on that, I would really welcome input, because I don't have all the answers. So you can email me, marcus@laughs-last.com. So
Brilliant.
That's my holding company. He who laughs last, laughs longest.
This is very true. Well, Marcus, thank you so much for your time. It's been,
Thank you.
it's been enlightening.